The check was for $10 million. I held it in both hands at the conference table while my attorneys watched me, and I stared at those zeros until they blurred at the edges. $10 million. And all I could think about was the way the gravel on the shoulder of Route 7 had bitten through the fabric of my suit trousers when Officer Brad Kowalski pressed his knee into my spine and said, "Stay still." I was a United States federal judge. I had been still my entire life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Marcus Ellison. I was born in Gary, Indiana, in 1979, the second of 4 children to parents who had nothing to give me except an example of dignity maintained under pressure. My father drove a beat-up '87 Buick that smelled of pine sol and old cigarettes, and whenever someone looked at him sideways in traffic, he would grip the steering wheel hard enough to whiten his knuckles and say absolutely nothing. I watched him do that for 18 years. I told myself I would be different. I studied every night under a kitchen light while my younger siblings slept. Northwestern law, top 10% of my class. Clerkship under Judge Beverly Franklin in Chicago. Assistant U.S. Attorney for 6 years, then a federal judgeship at 32. The youngest federal judge in the state of Illinois at the time. The day I was confirmed, my father came to the ceremony in a new suit he'd had pressed at the dry cleaner where he used to work evenings. When the robes went on, he hugged me and said quietly, right into my ear, "Now nobody can question you, son." I believed him. I had believed him for 11 years. The Escalade was a 2021. Black on black, every available option, leather seats that still carried that specific new car smell even 2 years on. I knew what some of my colleagues thought when they saw me climb into it. I'd heard the jokes, told gently, with just enough deniability to remain jokes, but unmistakable in their meaning. I drove it anyway. I had earned it, down to the last chrome detail, and I was not going to apologize for that. October 14th was a Tuesday. I had a 9 a.m. sentencing hearing for a man named Henderson. 4 years mandatory minimum, a file I'd read through 3 times, and a 2 o'clock status conference that my clerk Sophie had been messaging me about since Monday morning. I was running 6 minutes late because I'd spilled coffee on my dress shirt and had to change. My wife Renee stood in the kitchen doorway laughing at me while I knotted my tie a second time. "You and that coffee," she said. She handed me a piece of toast slathered with hot sauce, the way I've always liked it, and I kissed her and grabbed my briefcase and told her I'd be home before 7. My daughter Maya was 3 years old and still in her pajamas, standing at the kitchen entrance and holding a stuffed elephant she'd named Gerald. She held up her free hand in a small wave. "Bye, Daddy." I ruffled her hair, soft and warm under my palm. I remember the smell of the toast. I remember thinking, as I backed down the driveway, that everything in my life was very good. I merged onto Route 7 heading east, doing 60 and a 65. The morning light came in at a flat angle, and I had my sunglasses on. Coltrane on the radio. A Love Supreme. The first movement, that patient, repeating bass figure. I was working through the Henderson sentencing in my mind, weighing the mitigating factors his attorney had submitted. Then I glanced at the rearview mirror, and the lights came on behind me. Blue and red, strobing hard in the gray October morning. I checked my speed. 60. I checked my lane. Straight and clean, nowhere near the lines. I frowned, but I pulled over without hesitation. My father had taught me the protocol, and 11 years of being a black man in America had reinforced every line of it. Hands on the wheel, visible. Announce every movement. Do not give them a reason. I put the car in park turned the coal train down to nothing, and waited. He took his time. I watched in the side mirror as he sat in the cruiser for a full 2 minutes before the door finally opened. Young, mid-20s, sandy hair tucked under the department cap, heavy set in the way that looks entirely at home inside a patrol uniform. He walked to my window with a deliberate, unhurried slowness. Not the slowness of caution, the slowness of a man performing authority for his own satisfaction. "License and registration," he said. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. I moved toward the glove compartment in a slow, telegraphed arc, both hands always visible. "My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it now." He said nothing. I handed him both documents. He looked at the license. Then he looked at me. Then back at the license. The look lasted a beat too long, half a second that contained an entire conversation I had not consented to having. "You know why I stopped you?" he said. "I don't," I answered, keeping my voice flat and steady. I was doing 60 in a 65 zone. He looked past me into the car, the leather interior, the rosewood trim on the dash. And then his eyes settled on the judicial parking permit sitting in my center console, a laminated card issued by the federal courthouse in Springfield, bearing the seal of the United States District Court for the Central District of Illinois. He looked at that card for a very long moment without saying anything. Then he looked back at me. "This your vehicle?" he said. There it was. That cold thing shifted in my chest, not quite panic, not yet, but a recognition as physical as a sudden drop in temperature. I knew that question. Every black man I had grown up with knew that question. It wasn't about the car. It was a test of whether he was going to allow me to exist inside it. "Yes," I said. "It is." He took my documents back to his cruiser. I sat with both hands resting on the wheel and watched the second hand on my watch. 1 minute, 2, 5, 8. He stayed in that cruiser for 12 full minutes. I didn't touch my phone even when it buzzed twice. Sophie again, almost certainly. I stared straight through the windshield at the empty road ahead and felt the old familiar pressures settle down across my shoulders. That weight I had spent 30 years and every credential and every achievement in my life trying to lift for good. It had found me again on an empty highway at 8:43 in the morning, with hot sauce toast still warm in my stomach and my daughter's little wave still fresh in my memory. When Kowalski finally came back, he had a second officer with him. I hadn't seen the backup arrive. The second man was older, heavy, with a gray mustache, and he hung back near my rear quarter panel with his arms folded across his chest, watching without expression while Kowalski came to my window. "Step out of the vehicle," Kowalski said. "On what grounds?" I started. "Step out of the vehicle, sir." The "sir" landed with surgical precision, not courtesy, performance. I knew the difference. I got out slowly, both hands visible at all times, each movement deliberate and pre-announced. The air was 41 degrees, and I had no coat, just my suit and tie. I stood on the asphalt shoulder and put my hands on the roof of my Escalade when Kowalski told me to. The metal was ice cold under my palms. I heard him behind me, speaking in a low, constructed voice. Something about a vehicle matching a description. Something about an outstanding on a similar plate. I knew it was theater. I knew it from the first syllable. But knowing a thing is theater does not protect you when the stage is a highway shoulder and the audience is no one. He told me to get on my knees. I looked down at the asphalt, at the gravel and grit ground into it. I was wearing a $600 suit. I had a federal sentencing hearing in 40 minutes. A semi rumbled past on the highway, and the displaced air hit me like a fist. A car going the other direction slowed, and I saw a woman's face in the passenger window looking at me with an expression I will not describe, because there are no words for what it felt like to be seen that way. I got on my knees. The gravel drove through the fabric of my trousers instantly, sharp and precise. And then Kowalski put his knee into my back, almost casual about it, like pressing a hand to a door to hold it, and said, "Stay still." My voice, when it came out, was completely level, quieter than I expected. "My name is Marcus Ellison. I am a United States federal judge for the Central District of Illinois. I am formally requesting that you contact the clerk of the federal courthouse in Springfield before you take a single additional step." There was a silence. Then the older officer moved for the first time. He walked to my passenger window and looked in at the parking permit on the console. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at my license in Kowalski's hand. Then he looked at me, kneeling on the asphalt in a suit and a tie on a Tuesday morning. "That what it says?" the older one asked quietly. "That's exactly what it says," I said. Kowalski's knee came off my back. Slowly. I heard the shift of gravel under his boot as he stood. Another silence, the kind that has texture and weight, the kind that fills a space the way cold water fills a room. He held my documents out toward me. He was not looking at my face. He was looking at a point somewhere past my right shoulder with the fixed, deliberate blankness of a man working very hard to feel nothing at all. "You're free to go," he said. I stood up. I looked down at my left knee, torn fabric, gravel pressed into the wool. I looked at Kowalski. I took my license and registration from his hand. I got back into my car and I put on my seatbelt and I pulled back onto Route 7. I drove 200 yards. Then I pulled over again, put the Escalade in park, and sat completely still while my hands shook against the steering wheel so hard the leather trembled under my grip. My briefcase sat on the passenger seat. The parking permit was still in the console. Coltrane was still waiting, paused, in the middle of a love supreme. Outside, the morning was gray and cold and entirely indifferent. I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone. I dialed my attorney. He picked up on the second ring. "David," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." David Mercer had been my attorney for 9 years. We had met at a Northwestern alumni dinner, argued about criminal sentencing reform for 2 hours over bad Pinot Noir, and become close enough that he had danced at my wedding. He was 51 years old, 6'2", the kind of calm that comes from having sat across negotiating tables from people who wanted to destroy his clients for 3 decades. When I finished telling him what had happened on Route 7, there was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to make me check my screen to see if the call had dropped. "Say that back to me," David said finally. "The knee. On your back. On the asphalt." "Yes." "While you were in the suit?" "Yes." "And you identified yourself before or after?" "After the kneeling instruction. Before he put his weight down." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, more deliberate, the way it got when he was no longer having a conversation, but beginning to build something. "Marcus, do not move that car. Tell me exactly where you are." I gave him the mile marker. He told me to call the chief judge's office and explain I would be late, to say nothing about the reason to anyone except the chief judge personally, and to turn on my phone's voice memo function and leave it running. Then he said, "Is the body cam footage retrievable?" I told him every patrol car in the county had been equipped with mandatory dash and body cameras since 2019. He said, "Good," in a tone that did not sound like relief. It sounded like the beginning of a plan. I drove to the courthouse. I was 19 minutes late to the Henderson sentencing, which had never happened in 11 years on the bench. Sophie looked at me with wide eyes when I came through the chamber's door, at the torn knee of my trousers, at the redness still visible on my palms from the cold metal roof of the car. "Judge, are you—" "I'm fine," I said, and the flatness in my own voice surprised me. I changed into the spare trousers I kept in my closet for the rare occasion of a spilled lunch. I went into the courtroom. I sentenced Henderson. I ran the status conference at 2. I did everything I was supposed to do, and I did it with a precision that was, I realize now, its own form of defiance. Because the alternative, letting that morning on Route 7 collapse the structure of my professional day, was something I refused to give Kowalski. He had already taken enough. That evening, I met David at his office downtown. He had a legal pad covered in notes and a court reporter he'd brought in on short notice to take my formal statement. While I talked, he wrote. When I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me across the desk. "The department is going to move fast," he said. "Once they realize what they've got on their hands, a federal judge, a mandatory body cam incident, they'll have an internal affairs report filed within 24 hours and someone calling it a misunderstanding within 48. The body cam footage is the entire case. We need it preserved before anything happens to it." Can they erase it? Legally, no. Have departments had technical malfunctions at convenient moments? He tilted his head. We are not going to rely on their good faith. I'm filing an emergency preservation motion tonight. He filed it at 11:14 that evening. The footage was preserved by court order by 6 the following morning. And that was when the first thing that nobody expected happened. The footage was not just Kowalski's body camera. It was also the dash camera from the backup unit, the older officer, whose name turned out to be Sergeant Paul Dreyer. And when David and I reviewed the footage in his office 2 days later, we discovered that Dreyer had not been a passive bystander. At minute 4 of the stop, while Kowalski was still running my plates in the cruiser, Dreyer could be heard clearly on his own dash mic speaking into his radio. "Yeah, some guy in a tricked-out Escalade. No obvious reason he should have it. Running the plate now." The temperature in that office dropped about 10 degrees when David played it the second time. Some guy. That was the language. Not the driver, not the registered owner. Some guy, as in a person who does not fit inside this vehicle according to the world as Dreyer understood it. I had thought this was Kowalski's story. It was not. It was a culture story, and Kowalski was just the most visible face of it. David filed the civil rights suit under Section 198 4 days after the incident. The 4th and 14th Amendment violations, excessive force, unlawful detention, racial discrimination. He named Kowalski, Dreyer, the department, and the county. The number at the top of the complaint was $10 million. I had not chosen that number. David had. "It has to be large enough to be real," he said. "Not symbolic, real." When I asked him what he thought the case was actually worth, he set his pen down very deliberately and said, "Every black man who ever got on his knees on a highway shoulder without a federal judgeship to protect him." I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. The department's response came through their attorney 11 days later. It was exactly what David had predicted. A statement expressing that the stop had been conducted according to protocol, that a clerical error regarding a similar plate had prompted the call, that the officers had behaved appropriately given available information, and that the incident was being reviewed internally with the full commitment of the department to officer accountability. It was 22 paragraphs of carefully constructed nothing. David read it, set it on his desk, and said, "Great, they want to dance. We know how to dance." What followed was 3 months of the kind of legal combat that happens quietly, in conference rooms and deposition suites, with no cameras and no audience. I was deposed for 4 hours. Kowalski was deposed for 6. His attorney objected to 61 questions. David let every objection land and then asked the same question from a different angle. Patient as water, finding a crack in stone, Dreyer was deposed separately. And it was in that deposition that the second thing no one expected happened. Under oath, under the pressure of David's methodical questioning, Dreyer admitted that he had pulled up my license plate during the stop. Not because of any outstanding, not because of any call, but because, and I am quoting directly from the transcript here, the vehicle seemed inconsistent with the registration. He said it like a man who genuinely did not understand why that sentence was a problem. The court reporter's fingers didn't even pause. David let 3 full seconds of silence pass before he said, very gently, "Inconsistent how?" Dreyer said, "It was just a feeling." David wrote something on his legal pad and said, "No further questions at this time." I was sitting 3 feet away from Dreyer when he said that. I watched his face. He was not a cruel man, I understood in that moment. He was something, in certain ways, harder to prosecute in a courtroom. A man so thoroughly marinated in a particular understanding of the world that he had ceased to notice it at all. That did not make what happened on Route 7 any less of what it was. But it made the loneliness of it land in a specific, exhausting way. I thought about my father in his Buick, his hands whitening on the steering wheel, 18 years of Route 7 mornings saying nothing. The night before mediation, I could not sleep. Renee was up at midnight, found me at the kitchen table with cold coffee and the deposition transcript spread out under the overhead light. She sat down across from me and didn't say anything for a while. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly through the wet street. "You don't have to keep reading those," she said finally. "I know. So why are you?" I looked at the page in front of me. Dreyer's words, typed in clean serif font, perfectly neutral on the page. It was just a feeling. I thought about the gravel through the wool of my suit, about the semi that had passed while I was on my knees, about the woman in the car who had looked at me. "Because I want to remember exactly what it was," I said, "before someone writes a check and calls it resolved." Renee put her hand over mine on the table. Her wedding ring was cold from the night air. We sat like that for a long time. The mediation was held on a Tuesday, the same day of the week as the stop, which David later said was entirely coincidental, and which I did not believe for a second. The county's attorneys came in with an opening number that was an insult dressed up as a settlement offer. David set the paper down without changing his expression and said, "We'll see you in court." They came back 3 hours later with a number that was better and still not enough. David said the same thing. The mediator, a former federal judge herself, a small, precise woman named Harriet Osei Bonsu, who I had appeared before twice and who looked at no one during the proceedings with anything resembling warmth, called a recess at 4 p.m. and spent 40 minutes in a room with the county's lead attorney. When they came back, the number on the table had $10 million at the top of it. The room was very quiet. I looked at the paper. I thought about what David had said about what the case was actually worth. I thought about it for a long time. Then I picked up the pen Kowalski resigned from the department 6 weeks after the settlement was announced, citing personal reasons, in a 2-sentence letter obtained by the local press. He was 27 years old with no transferable skills outside law enforcement and a civil rights settlement attached to his name that would follow him into every future background check. Dreyer retired early with a reduced pension after the department's internal review classified his conduct as a serious procedural violation. The department was required under the settlement terms to implement mandatory bias training, body camera audits, and an independent civilian review board. Changes that the county had been resisting for 4 years before Route 7 gave them no more room to resist. The story ran in the Tribune, the Sun-Times, and eventually in the national press. I did not give interviews. David issued a statement on my behalf. I went back to work on a Monday morning and sentenced a man to 8 years for wire fraud, and presided over a civil dispute about a commercial lease. And I drove to work in my black Escalade on a different route that added 4 minutes to my commute. I took that route for 2 months before I didn't anymore. Before I got back on Route 7. 6 months after the settlement, on a March morning when the Illinois sky was the pale white of old paper and the roads still carried the last of the winter salt, I passed mile marker 7 on Route 7 at exactly 60 miles per hour. I had my sunglasses on. There was no music in the car. I had turned it off a mile back, without fully understanding why, the way the body sometimes knows things before the mind catches up. I passed the spot. The shoulder was empty. Just asphalt, gravel, dead grass, a guardrail going silver in the early light. I looked at it as I passed. I kept driving. That evening, I came home to Maya, standing at the kitchen entrance in her pajamas, older now, almost 4, holding Gerald the elephant in her left hand and raising her right in a small, serious wave. "Daddy's home," she announced, to no one in particular, with the complete certainty of someone reporting a fact about the world. I picked her up and she smelled of soap and dinner and the particular warmth of a child who has been recently bathed. I held her for a moment longer than usual. My father called after dinner. He'd seen something about the case in the news. Someone had sent him a link. And he had waited 6 months to call about it, which was exactly the kind of patience I had inherited from him and the kind I had spent 30 years not understanding and now did. "Son," he said, "you all right?" "I'm all right, Dad." A pause. His voice, when it came back, was very quiet. "I taught you to stay still," he said. "I'm sorry about that." I looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard, at the motion sensor light just beginning to flicker on over the garage. "You taught me to survive," I said. "That was the right thing to teach me then. This was the right thing to do now. Both are true." Another silence, the comfortable kind. Then he said, "I know." And the thing in those 2 words, the weight and the pride and the relief, was enough to last a long time. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment. The overhead light was on, and the house was warm, and the coffee on the counter was still hot. I poured a cup and stood at the window drinking it slowly, looking out at the yard. It tasted like nothing complicated at all. My father used to grip that steering wheel and say nothing. I understood why. And I understood, finally and completely, why I never would again.